turnout for this, I think, timely and troubling issue we're all going to be confronting today and in the future. When we decided to have this event on November 13th, we suspected it'd be a good chance it was going to feel like a very, very timely question and concern. As you all know, immigration played an enormous role and often a pretty ugly role in this past presidential campaign. And I guess one thing I want to say at the outset before I turn things over to the panel is just if anybody here is concerned about their own immigration status and these kinds of things, just we recognize this is very personal. It's going to be a theoretical conversation in a lot of ways, but this is a very, very personal issue for a lot of people on this campus. And just know that we feel your concern, and we're always on your side, and we'll always be behind students. Okay. So again, the theme for today: immigration, authoritarianism, and democracy. Not just an American issue. All around the world, we're seeing immigration being weaponized politically. We're seeing immigrants being demonized, dehumanized, insulted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, often in a variety of different authoritarian projects. And so this is certainly part of the concerns we'll be talking about today. But we're just also in a world where immigration flows are just getting bigger and bigger, climate change, wars, et cetera. So immigration is a real issue, but how we think about immigration has enormous implications for whether we're going to be a democracy, whether we're not going to be a democracy. So we've got an amazing panel of people. I'm really, really grateful, especially to Nandini Day, postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for Emerging Democracies, who's done this whole thing, put this together. She'll be moderating, introducing our incredible group. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Q&A because we have a great turnout online and a great turnout in person. So thank you all for coming. I think it shows like a lot of solidarity. Everyone's concerned about this issue, and that feels good to see in a difficult month for a lot of us. So thanks so much. And Nandini.
Thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you especially to our speakers who have come from different places to talk to us today about this important issue. I'm quickly going to introduce the speakers in the order in which they present, and then everyone will have roughly 10 to 12 minutes to talk. And then since this is quite a big audience, I think we'll move it to audience Q&A between both in the room and in person. So thank you all for coming, and please let me welcome our speakers. So we have Alexandra Filindra from the University of Illinois in Chicago. She is a professor of political science and psychology at the at UIC. She has served as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics and associate editor of political psychology. She has also been a Public Voices Fellow, and she specializes in American land politics, immigration policy, intergroup relations, in-group identity politics, and issues of political violence. Her book, Race, Rights, and Rifles, The Origins of the NRA and Contemporary Gun Culture, from the University of Chicago Press, analyzes the origins of the NRA and the relationship between ideologies of citizenship and support for guns, anti-democratic norms, and political violence. And it was recognized with an honorable mention for the best book published in 2023 by the APSA Political Psychology. Next, we will have Erin Chung. Erin Chung is the Charles D. Miller Professor of East Asian Politics at Johns Hopkins University. She previously served as founding co-director of the Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship Program, as well as director of the East Asian Studies Program at Hopkins. She is the author of Immigration and Citizenship in Japan and Immigrant Incorporation in East Asian Democracies, two different books, which received, the second of which received the 2021 AFA Asia and Asian American Section Transnational Asia Book Award, as well as the honorable mention from the APSA's Migration and Citizenship section in 2021. And a 2021 Research Excellence Award from the Korea Ministry of Education and the National Research Foundation of Korea. She is currently co-editor of the Politics and Society of East Asia Elements series at CUP, Cambridge University Press, as well as co-PI for the initiative on critical responses to anti-Asian violence at Hopkins. Then we have our very own Rebecca White, who is a PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on how migrants and refugees are able to gain equitable access to resources when they settle in host communities. especially in the age of growing natural resource scarcity. She's particularly interested in how local community institutions can help integrate migrants into host communities. Her dissertation project focuses on farmer groups in Uganda that bring refugees and host communities together. Her work has been supported by the United States Institute of Peace, the American Political Science Association, as well as the Russian graduates here. She is a recipient of the Center for Emerging Democracies Graduate Fellowship, and most recently has been awarded the prestigious doctoral dissertation research improvement grant from the American Political Science Association. And then we have Sylvia Pedraza, also from our very own Department of Sociology and American Culture at the University of Michigan. Her research interests include the sociology of immigration, race, and ethnicity in America, and the sociology of Cuba's revolution and exodus. Her work seeks to understand the causes and consequences of immigration as a historical process that forms and transforms persons and nations. She is a prolific scholar and author of numerous books and articles, including Political Disaffection in Cuba's Revolution and Exodus, on Cambridge University Press, and Revolutions in Cuba and Venezuela, One Hope, Two Realities, co-authored with Carlos A. Romero. She has received various prestigious grants and awards, including from the National Science Foundation, as well as the John D. and Catherine B. Johnson Foundation. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you. I am very happy to be here with you, and thank you to Dan and to the Institute for inviting me. I typically wear a couple of different hats because I study immigration policy in the United States as a phenomenon, and the development of immigration policy historically and contemporarily, but also I am very much interested in gun culture and the role of political violence, and increasingly thinking about the different conceptions of democracy and of the nation, of Americanness in the United States. But today, because I don't know what's going to happen as of January 20th in terms of immigration policy, what I am able to offer is the results from a survey that we have been doing since May. We have been doing a daily cross-sectional survey, which is now about 13,000 people. Since May, we stopped fielding it on election day. And it includes questions about the election, vote choice. So I will be talking about vote choice in the 2024 election. And, you know, immediately after the election, one of the favorite explanations that I started seeing on the more left of center media, you know, Senator Bernie Sanders said it should come as no big surprise that the Democratic Party, which was abandoned by working class people, would find the working class had abandoned them. I was watching Joe Scarborough on MSNBC saying that the Democrats just didn't get how really real the economic problems of the middleman are, and that economic anxiety is what shifted the dynamics, and ultimately Kamala Harris didn't provide assurances on economic issues. She didn't provide an agenda that was appropriate. So there was a lot about this economic anxiety hypothesis. We've been on the economic anxiety rodeo. This is the third time, essentially, that basically in 2016 too, people were talking about economic anxiety, and that's what pushed voters towards Trump at the time. We were coming out of the 2008 a crisis, and there was sort of a backlash to all that anxiety of the years and years of economic crisis. But what we learned from 2016 and 2020 is that, there we go, that really the key predictors of support for Trump have not been related to economic performance or economic anxiety. That time and again, studies have shown that racism and xenophobia were key to this 2016 election. Racism and xenophobia were key in 2020. When it comes to sexism, and sexism is measured with the hostile sexism index, which asks people on a 6-point scale how true or false these statements are. Women seek to gain power by getting control over men. Discrimination against women is no longer a problem in the United States. So again, high are people who basically said from very true to slightly true on this, and low is the people who basically rejected the statement. And we see here among all groups, there's a 36% Trump advantage among sexists compared to 8% advantage among economically anxious people. And we see here that the effects are not just concentrated among white Americans. Yes, it is a huge gap, 58 percentage points difference among high sexists in favor of Trump. She gets 21% of them, and he gets 79% of them, whereas low sexists actually break for Harris. But we see very large effects here across all groups. 18 percentage points difference among high sexists among Latinos. That's a really big difference. She lost between low and high Latinos. She goes from 68% to 41%. Even among African Americans, she loses 21 percentage points in support between the two groups. That is very substantial. And also among the other groups, the other races, you see very, very large effects as well. So this is obviously far more of a factor. Yeah. Then we look at xenophobia. Xenophobia is here measured in terms of immigrants will likely take jobs away from citizens. And America's culture is generally harmed by immigrants. Again, those who agree with this are the highs, and those who disagree with this are the lows. Here, the effect is even larger. The overall difference is 52 percentage points in favor of Trump among those high on xenophobia, and basically 38 percentage points in favor of Harris among those low in xenophobia. And this is true again across groups. We see xenophobia playing a significant role. It shouldn't be a surprise given the narratives of the campaign and given the way that immigrants were portrayed by the Trump campaign. It should also not be a surprise because of how Governor Abbott of Texas, played the issue by sending migrants to major cities. In Chicago, it was a huge concern, and people got very, very upset in places that were minority neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, where migrants were put in shelters. In New York, it's the same story. And one of the analyses that we plan to do in the future is look at precinct data in relation to where the migrants were located to see whether support for the Democrats collapsed relative to 2020. specifically in those locations relatively to places that were further away. But in my neighborhood, which is basically on the north side of Chicago, which is a very liberal, neighborhood, people were very upset that their yoga center, the Armory, which is a community center, was taken over, and they didn't have their yoga programs because immigrants were scared. So it's not surprising to me the role that xenophobia played in this election. We can also see multivariately. This is a multivariate model where basically I actually split here the people both by class in terms of education level, because that's the best measure of class that we have. So whether people have a college degree and they're anxious, or no college degree and they're anxious or not anxious. And we see again that there is a little bit of an effect, but interestingly enough, it's stronger among college and anxious. Like they broke more in favor of Trump than did people who did not have a college degree. So we see this suggests a switch from what is expected, which was that college people would actually vote for her more than for the Democrats. In this data, we actually see that at least anxious people with a college degree broke for Trump. And of course, we see, interestingly, also we see young people breaking for Trump. The reference category here is 18 to 29. And basically, if you look at age 65 plus, this is the difference between the two, right? So you can imagine that the reference category is pretty much as far on the other side as the age 65 plus is towards Harris. So for those who are not familiar with this type of graph, this is support for Trump, this is support for Harris. Anything that's on the red line is basically null. And the things that are null is gender, Latino. So Latinos basically overall do not get affected. Basically, they split. And income, basically, there's a tiny effect of lower income breaking for Trump. But essentially, a lot of the demographic groups, once you account for sexism, really, that was not the story. The gender gap was not the story. The sexism gap is the story. And we see that actually sexism played a role across party groups. So this is for the GOP, independents, and Democrats. And what we see here again is that sexism is significant, breaking for Trump across the board. No, this didn't. Where is it? There we go. So here we go. Sorry, doing two things at the same time. And yeah, so, and basically, even for Democrats, it was anxious college graduates who actually voted for Trump among Democrats. It wasn't the working class. It wasn't really the no college degrees. And the findings are exactly the same for xenophobia, basically. So in conclusion, if there is a mandate here, it's a mandate that is based on this type of voter that is motivated by outgroup attitudes, and that this is going to affect both the policy priorities of the new administration. You can imagine that policies like a ban on abortion and very, very stringent immigration deportation policies are going to be priorities, because this is where the mandate is coming from. This is what people voted for. We will see what happens after January 20th and how we are going to address the next 4 years. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank the Center for Emerging Democracies, and especially Dr. Nandini Day for organizing this timely panel. Full disclosure, Dr. Day is my former graduate student at Hopkins, and in fact, this is probably the most time we've spent together since we finished the program. It's been a real treat to be here. So we're going to switch gears significantly here, not only because I work on a very different set of countries and regions, but also because I'm going to be approaching this largely through the lens of the relationship between immigration, authoritarianism, and democracy. Because my work tends to be much more comparative historical analysis, so it's going to be a very different approach, but I think you might find some interesting parallels. And most of all, I want to think through the ways in which the East Asian cases provide some insights for understanding some of the complexities and the politicization of immigration, and given the elections. So my work focuses largely on migration and citizenship politics in Northeast Asian democracies, which those of you who are familiar with it are non-Western democracies with among the largest economies in the world that both send and host substantial migrant populations, and have until recently maintained among the most exclusionary immigration policies among the world democracies, right? So they don't really fit easily into binary categories of countries of immigration versus emigration, or even the liberal versus illiberal migration framework. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are also often described as negative cases of immigration because of their low levels of immigration in relation to their levels of development, despite their labor shortages and impending demographic crises. They additionally raise some questions about the relationship between political regime type and migration regime. Specifically, the assumption that political liberalization will result in more liberal migration. So the dominant comparative scholarship on immigration and citizenship has tended to focus on cultural determinants, especially claims of ethnocultural homogeneity, to explain the so-called East Asian paradox, right? And so basically this account says that East Asian democracies represent exclusionary or ethnic citizenship and migration regimes that privilege dissent over liberal norms and that apply ascriptive criteria to membership and entry rights. But if you look really carefully, the East Asian cases don't really fit these ideal types very well. Nor can we say that Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are necessarily kind of the diametric opposite of liberal migration regimes, or simply an illiberal variant, right? As I mentioned, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan have among the most restrictive immigration policies among the world democracies that basically restrict immigration of small numbers of select migrants on the one hand, and that also generally prohibit or discourage permanent settlement among unskilled migrants, right? But at the same time, Japan and South Korea in particular have instituted expansive citizenship rights for foreign residents that in some areas surpass those that have been instituted by countries with more liberal immigration and citizenship policies. For example, in the area of political rights, right? South Korea has instituted local voting rights for permanent residents, and Japan has long had local foreign resident assembly. And in the areas of social welfare benefits, Japan makes almost no distinction between nationals and long-term residents. Right? Now, I argue that what we see is kind of specific patterns of migration management in East Asian democracies, really characterized by these partially open borders and then discrete institutionalized rights for specific subsections of migrant categories, right? Is not a reflection of an ethnic migration regime or even an illiberal migration regime, but rather migration control by developmental states that have historically prioritized economic development, national security, and social stability over democratic norms and equality. So in a recent article published in a special issue on rethinking the migration state in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, my co-authors, Darcy Drought and Yun-Chen Tian, and I point to the emergence of what we call a developmental migration state, which applies a strategic, goal-oriented approach to migration management to not only regulate who gets to come in and for what purpose, right, but also to directly recruit and in some cases return migrant workers and other migrants to address overarching goals for the national economy and society. So this means that the developmental migration state doesn't simply liberalize or restrict immigration policies according to the demands in the market or even specific political constituencies. On the contrary, the state plays an active role in recruiting particular specific categories of immigrants based on economic and social needs. So this applies not only to guest worker programs, but also to policies that pertain to international students, co-ethnic immigrants, and even marriage migrants. So, but this is not to say that developmental migration policies are unique to East Asian democracies, as they can be observed in a wide range of migration states. So I don't know what the level of specialization here is, but certainly we can see these kind of developmental migration policies in the kafala system in Gulf states, right? And also in the temporary agricultural workers permits that we see in North America, as well as in Europe, and of course the point system in Canada. And the developmental logic is also observable in immigration and diaspora engagement policies that seek to really promote economic development through this sort of diaspora engagement by increasing, for example, foreign exchange earnings, right? But while all migration states are developmental to a certain degree and may have these kind of developmental policies in some policy arenas, what distinguishes the developmental migration state in East Asia from their counterparts is the centrality of the developmental logic in every area of migration policy, right? So this pertains to migrant labor policies that guarantee worker protections according to the productive capacity of different workers, right? As well as forms of demographic engineering, right? In heavily gendered family migration policies that recruit largely female marriage preference to resolve the population crisis, right? The rapidly decreasing population in Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. And of course, the inconsistent application of dissent in co-ethnic immigration policy, right? That really go against the idea that this is an ethnic citizenship regime that privileges some categories of co-ethnics over others according to these kind of macroeconomic developmental goals. And an example of that is the privileged overseas Korean visa, which is kind of provides overseas Koreans who qualify with quasi-dual citizenship rights, but at its inception originally excluded Koreans from China and the former Soviet Union and privileged Koreans from the United States and Japan, right? So these have formed hierarchies even among co-ethnic immigrants. So this multi-tier system, which is built largely on the proliferation of multiple visa categories, right? Almost a mind-numbing number of categories in the context of relatively closed borders, has institutionalized hierarchies among non-citizens with differential rights to entry, employment, settlement, even things like voting rights, quasi-dual citizenship rights, social welfare benefits, and so forth, right? So does this mean that there is no regime effect, right? That's the question that I pose to myself. And I would argue that regime type does matter in East Asian cases, but in ways that we may not expect. So global human rights norms have not pushed Korea, Japan, and Taiwan to liberalize their immigration policies, much like the convergence hypothesis would have predicted, right? Nor were domestic political elites like bureaucrats or left-leaning parties the drivers for expanded migrant rights or immigration reform, much like the case studies of North American and Western European cases have found, right? Instead, in East Asia, immigration reform migrant rights and immigrant incorporation became an important part of the equation only when civil society actors pushed them onto the agenda. But the presence of civil society actors alone is insufficient for explaining the cross-national variations between the three cases, especially from the mid-2000s. And given the time, I'm going to do something that I always advise my graduate students not to do at the end of their talks, which is to introduce new information. Because I'm doing this because I don't want to end by implying that there's no political agency at a moment when many of us might feel disempowered. Okay. So in my book on immigrant incorporation in East Asian democracies, I introduced the concept of civic legacies, which refers to the ideas, strategies, and networks used in previous movements for democratic inclusion that differentially shape the direction of immigrant political incorporation on the one hand, but also the potential for structural reform. And I'm going to now give a 3-minute summary of my 3 cases, because that's the time I have left, I believe. So migrant advocacy in Korea built on the civic legacy of past rights-based national movements, specifically Korea's recent democratization movement and the history of the strong tradition of labor and civil society activism to really push for the implementation of a formal guest worker program in 2004 that would guarantee migrant workers the same rights as Korean native workers, right? So this resulted in a type of major structural change. In Japan, grassroots movements that were led by generation of colonial era migrants and their descendants known as Zainichi Koreans that from the 1960s in what I call a non-citizen civil rights movement in my first book, set the foundation for the decentralized community-based programs for incorporating new immigrants from the late 1980s. But at the same time, this very kind of civic legacy also posed barriers for structural reform of migrant worker policies in Japan, because the central ideational frame that was used in this non-citizen civil rights movements, which is focused on what was called the foreign resident citizen or the Gaikokujin Shinin, really focused on the idea that these were significant because they were permanent, law-abiding, who were contributing to the common good. And so this really widened the gap between long-term, legally registered foreign residents on the one hand, and on the other, migrant workers who are widely perceived, including by the foreign residents themselves, the long-term residents themselves, as temporary and unauthorized, right? So this is a very familiar story. And finally, Taiwan's civic legacy stemming from the contentious struggle for both democratization and indigenization. So the idea of Taiwan for Taiwanese, right, for native Taiwanese, left migrant workers with very few allies within civil society who really saw no place for them as outsiders, right, in Taiwan's democratic project. So even though Taiwan was the first among the 3 countries to implement a guest worker program, so it was a decade before Korea and almost 3 decades before Japan, it's been the slowest in addressing immigrant rights and recognition, as well as labor protections for migrant workers and local support services for foreign residents. So what do the East Asian cases tell us? I'm coming to an end here. So rather than assume that the liberalization of immigration policies is an inevitable outcome of political liberalization, or that view specific immigration policy reforms as indicators of a broad liberalization, right, in immigration policies. The East Asian cases really caution us to recognize that liberal migration regimes are far from becoming the universal model, right? Especially as so-called traditional countries of immigration like the United States enact increasingly restrictive measures to curb immigration, it's becoming difficult for us to justify the liberal-illiberal dichotomy in our classification of migration states. And as we brace for sweeping immigration restrictions and the corrosion of already weak safety nets and protections for migrants in the Trump administration, the East Asian cases also remind us of the critical role that migrant advocacy plays, even in countries with immigration policies that resemble more those of autocratic than democratic regimes. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks so much to the Center for Emerging Democracies for asking me to be on this panel with scholars who I really hope to be like in the future. When you were introducing them, I was like, wow, I really hope my introduction sounds like that. And I publish a book in the future. But for now, so my research focuses on immigrant native relations, specifically refugee host relations in Uganda. And I want to talk to everyone about how understanding the state of refugees in the world right now can maybe give us a global perspective about immigration and maybe help us learn a few lessons that can apply to immigration policy in general. But first, I thought I should do a bit of convincing about why refugees are important, even to those who just care about immigration more generally. I think people tend to think about refugees and immigrants as different in two ways. First, why they move, so forcibly versus voluntarily, and second, how long they stay in their host country or country of reception. To the first point, as I will show a bit later, while people do understand the difference between the term refugee and immigrant, people don't necessarily draw that distinction in their mind in terms of who is more deserving or not. Secondly, people usually think that refugee stays are more temporary than migrants who usually move for economic reasons. And therefore, refugee policies in many hosting countries treat refugees as transient. However, as you can see, 66% of refugees have been in exile for more than 5 years, and the number of refugees who have been in exile for more than 20 years have gradually increased as there have been very protracted conflicts that we've seen in the news. And I think, So I just want to give you some numbers. So globally, more than 120 million people have been forcibly displaced by May of 2024 this year. And this is a 40% increase since just 2021. And of those, 43 million are refugees, meaning that they have fled their country of origin, and the rest are internally displaced people. And I think because immigration and asylum seekers and refugees are so salient in Western elections and news cycles, people think that Western countries host most of the refugees in the world, but that's simply not the case. 75% of refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries. The top 3 refugee hosting countries are Turkey, Colombia, and Uganda. And I think remembering that will help us understand and give us a bit more empathy about understanding the immigration and refugee situation in the world. And it's also important to understand that Western countries know that developing countries bear the burden of hosting refugees. And much of their international aid is targeted at ensuring that these conditions in these hosting countries aren't so dire that the refugees and even economic migrants want to move to Western countries. After the EU experienced mass migration in 2015, the EU directed 3 billion euros towards what they say as addressing the root causes and of re-civilization, forced displacement, and irregular migration in Africa specifically. So we have to understand that there are practical concerns of how countries deal with migration, but also understand the political motivations behind seemingly benevolent policies like international aid. So the UNHCR did an amazing cross-country survey with Ipsos about attitudes towards refugees, and I want to share some findings with you on the next slide. Okay. So first, we see first they asked whether people agree with the statement that people should be able to take refuge in other countries, including my own country, to escape from war and persecution. And the global average is 73%, meaning that, it's pretty high, right? But the second question asks whether they agree that most foreigners who want to get into their country as a refugee aren't actually refugees, that they just want to come, go to their country for economic reasons and take advantage of welfare services. So a lot of, so meaning that they are very skeptical about the reasons. And globally, 61%, on average, 61% of survey respondents agree with this statement, meaning that there is a lot of skepticism. And I think, maybe to speak to Aaron's talk, Japan is 47% agree with this statement, which is lower than the global average. And I think we can learn from that when the state is involved, and you will see this with Uganda too, in my case, there is less skepticism if there is, the state is behind this migration or refugee policy. And when people are asked whether most refugees who come to their country will successfully integrate into the new society, the global average is 50%, also meaning that people are quite skeptical about whether refugees and migrants, refugees specifically, will integrate, about half-half. And lastly, when you were asked, compared to other countries around the world, would you say that your country has accepted more refugees than it should, less than it should, or about the right number? And the global average is that 49% of people say that that their country has accepted more than it should. So what can we learn from this? I think we can learn that NIMBYism, or not my backyard, is well and strong globally. And while people do agree that refugees do have legitimate reasons for fleeing their country, they don't want to host them. And unsurprisingly, people are really skeptical about the intentions of refugees. And we see this play out in the media with portrayals of the undeserving migrant or the asylum seeker that came in through the wrong way. And as we've learned from immigration is really an interesting issue. It doesn't fall cleanly within the lines of autocracy versus democracy, where authoritarianism doesn't necessarily equal an illiberal immigration regime, and democracy doesn't equal a liberal one. And we learned this from the case that I studied, Uganda, which has been an authoritarian regime for over 40 years, well, 40 years, but they've been ruled by President Museveni, the current dictator, for more than 40 years. And it has a refugee policy that has been called one of the most progressive and liberal in the world by UNHCR and other policy practitioners. And this isn't because of the goodness of President Museveni's heart. There are, of course, political motivations. And Alexander Batts has a really interesting article where he looks at the dictators throughout since Uganda's independence and how they have dealt with Uganda's open refugee policy to buy international support and to guard against criticism of their authoritarian hold on power, because Western countries don't want lots of refugees to flee to the West. Therefore, they want Uganda to host them and they can't criticize the authoritarian leader who agrees to host them, right? And, Uganda is not liberal in other ways. They recently passed an Anti-Homosexuality Act, which punishes homosexuality with a death sentence. Westerners were so aghast that even Ted Cruz publicly criticized it. But I think Uganda is an interesting case study of a successful refugee hosting policy. And, it's my dissertation, so I'm biased, but I'm really interested in this question of integration. And I take it a bit further to look at how refugees and Ugandan nationals cooperate in their livelihoods and in their work. And I think one thing that Uganda gets right is understanding that if countries do want to take in refugees and immigrants, they need to make sure that they are settled in a sustainable way. That means that they have their basic needs met, but also that nationals do not see refugees as a burden. And better yet, that they see refugees as contributing to the community. They're really sensitive to the feeling of the relative deprivation of nationals comparing themselves to refugees, and they try to prevent it. UNHCR and the Ugandan government has a policy of 70-30, which is 70% of aid goes to refugees and 30% goes to the host community. And this is actually moving more to a 50-50 model because Ugandans feel like it's unfair that refugees are provided for and they are not. Refugees in Uganda and in many other developing countries are usually settled in disadvantaged and impoverished areas because, as this has proven, NIMBYism isn't just an American concept. So any kind of aid and development towards refugees is very obvious in these contexts. And, I of course know that because I'm a comparativist, that what is successful in Uganda does not might not apply in all other contexts. But what I study about integration of refugees into host communities is the role that local and community level institutions play. And these institutions, because of the aid context, are usually encouraged by the NGOs and government, and they put refugees and Ugandans in cooperative settings. If you have any familiarity with Gordon Allport's intergroup contact theory, these settings fulfill all four, which is that they are in a cooperative setting with relatively equal status, and they were working towards a common goal with the support of an authority, so an NGO or the government. And in a survey I ran with these participants in these institutions, I find that those who have experience with refugees and nationals in these diverse institutions are actually more accepting of refugees. And when I interview the participants, Ugandans speak of being able to talk to the refugees more to understand their experiences. And there's also one of the open theorized about how those who have experiences of violence in the past are more receptive to refugees because of the empathy that that they have. And Ugandans did go through a protracted civil war. And they talk about how, they were once refugees in Congo or South Sudan. So when Congolese and South Sudanese come to their country, of course, they will welcome them. And I think all this points to a mechanism for more receptive attitudes, which is empathy. And I think that this can be a very trite explanation, but I think it's important to think about empathy when we think about policymaking. Scholars of immigration in the West talk about how natives' negative attitudes towards immigrants are either a response towards economic threat or cultural threat. And many articles have concluded that cultural threat is stronger, but some recent work that I personally felt like has shown that natives are actually responding to an economic threat, but it is shown in they've espoused views as a cultural threat opposition. And I think across the world, we can see, including the US, that negative attitudes towards immigrants are because they think that natives think that immigrants are taking away their resources, which points to this question of economic anxiety and relative deprivation and deserving person of welfare or benefits. Or they think that they're not going to integrate well, which is this cultural threat, and that can be addressed with more contact to create more empathy. And I think in Uganda, I've seen these two issues tackled well. These institutions, local and community institutions, they show both refugees and nationals that they can be good partners in work and livelihood, that it's not a zero-sum game, that if you get something, someone else doesn't have to lose. And it does increase interaction between these two groups. It does create warmth and empathy and understanding, closing that gap. It's not all great, but I'm an immigrant myself, so I have to be optimistic about the state of the world. And I don't know how exactly these community institutions can be done in other contexts. And I might be giving you a very utopic view of things right now, but I think that if we can't train for a better, more empathetic world, we're never going to have one. Yeah.
Thank you. I am pleased to be last because it has given me a way of presenting the material to you. You're going to do my slide, right? Because I don't want to always Trump in the background. Well, I'm going to focus on Cuba and Venezuela, and in some ways, this is like Professor Chung focused on 3 East Asian cases. And in fact, I think what I have to say makes a lot of sense after what she has said, because all throughout your presentation, is sort of the central point was about the centrality of the developmental logic in everything that the governments in particular did with respect to immigration and development in the 3 cases of Korea, Japan, and what was the third one? And Taiwan. Thank you. In contrast to that, I think that if I look at Cuba and Venezuela, who have experienced revolutions, although very different revolutions, and it's hard to convey that to you in just a couple of minutes. But the centrality is not of the developmental logic, but of the political logic. And I think I can convey that perhaps fastest with the image that I learned from the work of Albert O. Hirschman, who talked about exit, voice, and loyalty in a very small book written way back in the 1970s, but very powerful for me because it was an image that I was able to use very well in my understanding in how, for example, the Cuban Revolution is now 66 years old, so it has gone through multiple presidents in the United States: Eisenhower, Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and now we're going to have Trump in it, So that's, that's an enormous political sweep. In the case of the Venezuelan Revolution, it's much younger. It dates back to 1999. It also was to take place through the electoral system. What Hugo Chavez wanted was to create, in effect, well, he wanted 2 things. One, to have a very, very strong alliance between Cuba and Venezuela, which was achieved. And the other one was that he wanted to create a socialism without poverty. And that's certainly not achieved. But the time span is much shorter, but still, the same sort of cast of characters over the course of time. So back to Albert O. Hirschman and how he has helped me to understand the relationship between migration and the political stages in the revolutions with his simple image of exit, voice, and loyalty. Okay, Hirschman, way back in the 1970s, proposed that the more exit there was from a particular, not necessarily a country, it could be, for example, a university, an organization, something that provides a set of goods or services to its members, and then those goods and services begin to deteriorate. And so people have only a couple of options. One option is to exit, to leave the country, and the other one is to express their voice, to protest against it. But essentially, the dynamic that Hirschman pointed to was that the more exit, the less voice. Okay, so that it really was like a seesaw, so that exit grows and voice declines. Okay. I found that very useful because of the centrality of what, following Professor Chung, I would call a political logic, in that both Cuba and Venezuela dealt with the opposition to their revolutions over 65 or 25 years by externalizing dissent, by getting rid of it, okay, by pushing it out. And that way they grew strong. And that was so because, in effect, people could not express their voice when, in fact, their voice consisted of leaving their countries. The rate of departure of people from Cuba and Venezuela is extraordinarily high. Right now, probably in both countries, about 27% of the population has left both countries. Okay? Again, over very different moments in time. But that, that's a humongous number of people that has left. And one would imagine that perhaps the largest number of people left in the early years of the revolution, in which there's a lot of confrontation going on between the people and the government, because a revolution, by definition, as a friend of mine pointed out to me, the word goes back to the French Revolution, révolution, in which everything is turned upside down, in effect, And in that process of having everything being turned upside down, a lot of confrontations take place, political, economic, social. For example, in the Cuban Revolution, the early years of the revolution, there's an enormous conflict between the new revolutionary government and the Catholic Church. And in effect, one of the things that Fidel Castro did was pushed out all the priests and nuns out of the country And so he got rid of religion for many, many, many years, in which the Cuban Revolution defined itself as an atheist revolution until in the late 80s, it began for another set of reasons to incorporate somewhat from civil society the religious life, and then it redefined itself as a secular nation in which religion can exist, although one wouldn't want to call it thrive, but it does at least, play a role. So, that's an example of relationships that take place over a great deal of time. So in both Cuba and under first Fidel Castro, then Raúl Castro, and now that the Revolutionary Guard of the people who made the revolution has Fidel Castro died a few years ago in 2016. His brother Raúl is still alive, but he's quite old, and he handpicked his successor, Miguel Díaz-Canel, who is 54 years old, so he wasn't hardly born at the time of the beginning of the revolution. And so it is for the first time a political leadership that has no ties to the early revolutionary process. And that, in fact, the people in Cuba don't like. Okay, they make fun of Díaz-Canel all the time. They call him all kinds of things. He looks good at the United Nations wearing a white guayabera. That's all I can say for that. But other than that, he doesn't have very much of a social basis, and particularly not having participated or been a part of the revolutionary process. So the political logic that I'm talking about, the centrality of the political logic, is that for many, many years in both revolutions, you see the governments trying to get rid of the opposition, what I call externalizing dissent, getting rid of dissent by, the dynamic of exiting. Okay. And of course, what that does is that people who are in the opposition either end up as political prisoners or they end up leaving the countries. And so it makes the government strong. But time passes and other situations take place. And then what begins to happen is that the people who have left begin to organize in new ways as immigrants in other lands, but they become new political actors. Okay. And sometimes they have an influence back in their country, not necessarily all the time either, because it's very difficult to be an immigrant and also be, politically central in the society in which you left. But nonetheless, the people who are first pushed out eventually acquire a new voice and in some ways try to affect the outcomes of the homelands that they left behind. So still, all the time there is a political logic. Now, something interesting happened with respect to Alfredo Hirschman's work, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, tiny little book written in the 1970s. And that is that he was actually present in another country where, again, there is a centrality of the political logic, and that was in Germany, particularly in the, DDR or GDR, depending on whether you're speaking German or in English. But Berlin was divided between East and West. And there was this massive flow of people that also took place from East to West. And as a result of which the German government built a wall to keep people from leaving the country because they realized that they were in effect hemorrhaging. I think it's correct. Thank you. That they were losing their social resources, their economic resources. Because, when you externalize dissent, that's a political logic again, but you're also getting rid of the economic, the social resources, the knowledge, the know-how that all of those people could have offered their country to have removed, so it does weaken the country. So the Hirschman was in Germany at the moment at which the wall fell, and he wrote another article published in 1993, in which he said that towards the end of the political process, like the one that he had, written about 23 years earlier, that it was possible, in fact, to have both an increasing exit and an increasing voice. Because towards the end of the political process that he had witnessed in East Berlin, that was what had happened, that both exit and voice had risen at the same time. I have myself seen that type of dynamic take place in Cuban society in recent years, in which both exit and voice have increased. to cover 65 years in just a couple of minutes, particularly with people that don't really know the background very much, is too much of a task. But I think that I can say that, for example, if you look at 6 waves of migration out of Cuba in the years of the revolution, there have been 6 distinct waves of migration. In migration studies, we use the image of a wave a lot because, as I usually tell my undergraduates, if you went swimming last summer, you went to the beach. And when you were standing in the beach, you can watch the wave and you can see that the sea is very still. And all of a sudden it begins to ripple, and all of a sudden it begins to grow, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger all the time. And then it peaks, and then, it froths, and then maybe it dies out on the beach. And that's exactly how migrants move, with precisely with that process and those moments. In the Cuban case, then one can, over the course of those 6 waves that I don't have the time to describe to you guys, it would take me an hour to do it justice. But there have been, for example, a couple of big years, in which a lot of migrants left. In 1980, the Mariel Exodus, as it was called, because people left from the Bay of Mariel, 125,000 Cubans left in 1 year. And then also in 1994, the Balseros crisis, the crisis of the Raptors, 36,000 people left in just 1 summer. And yet, you would think those were the moments of peak migration, of exodus from Cuban society. The last 2 years have seen 500,000 people leave from Cuba. And 500,000 people, not only is it much larger than it has ever been before, but it's also incredibly high in a country that is only 11 million people. So instead of things becoming better over time, they have in fact become worse. That much one can say, about 500,000 people leave in 2 years. And I have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people. At this point in time, I can't even remember how many people I've interviewed because I do it all the time. It just comes natural to me. And people's personal stories of drama, of struggle, of danger were so deep, so fascinating that for some years I stopped watching television because I thought my interviews were more interesting than the television. Then I have returned to the television, but I still sort of like, having this drive to interview people wherever I go, to listen to them, to hear what they have to say. And over again, what I have heard in recent years is an enormous, enormous disappointment that they love their homeland, but they see no future at all. And therefore they choose to live in any way that they can. And in the case of the Cuban exodus, because of the very long ties to American society, because of the growth of a very large Cuban American community in this country, well, then that country most of the time is in fact the United States. I have to wrap it up. So again, back to the centrality of the political logic, I think that perhaps what I can say is that the political logic drove government actions in both countries to such an extent that they pushed their opposition out. They tried to externalize dissent, but over the course of years, they have also suffered from the loss of resources that those very immigrants represent. Is there an emergent democracy? I asked myself when I came here, and I got a T-shirt that says Center for an Emergent Democracy. I can't say that at this point in time that I see a possibility in either country. Venezuela, as I'm sure some of you are aware, just went through a political process in which Maduro, who is, a very different, far less liked leader than Hugo Chavez was, but has the military behind him, which is very important. And we don't study the military enough, I think, in the social sciences. Maduro gave way to elections that ultimately ended up being fake elections, because the opposition remained, and that is a big difference between the Cuban case and the Venezuelan case, is that in the Cuban case, all of the opposition, practically speaking, left, thinking that 90 miles from the United States, they would be able to make a difference. In the Venezuelan case, a lot of the opposition left. Venezuela has lost now 8 million people. which is a phenomenal number of people, but nonetheless, they, they have lost all those people, but a lot of the opposition remained, political parties remained, they were largely disunited, fragmented, but in recent years, they found some good leadership in the couple of Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, and in true faith, they really thought that they could carry out an honest election that would be recognized as such. And to do that, they even did something that I did not know could be done until then, and that is that the voting booths, I don't know what to call them, booths, machines that the Venezuelans used, actually had what in Spanish are called actas de votación, a record. They left behind the record, a printed record of how many people had voted for one candidate and for another. So that in fact, the Venezuelan opposition has the proof that they won the elections. But the government, supported by the military, has refused to recognize it. United States, the European Union, Spain, many Latin American countries, the Organization of American States have all criticized Maduro, but he's still holding on and the military is still supporting him. So I don't see an emergent democracy coming out of Venezuela right now. And in the Cuban case, there hasn't even been the hope of a sham election. There just has been absolutely no movement in the direction of giving people more of the political voice in the country. And they're just hanging on. I think, sometimes people say at the end of a desperate situation, that that a country or an organization or a university, you name it, that they're standing at a crossroads. I don't think either Cuba or Venezuela are standing at a crossroads. I think they're standing at a precipice. But desperate as the situation is, they're still hanging on. And so it's going to take me a while before I can work. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. I think some great points have been put on the table. And one of the best things about having scholars coming in from very different perspectives is that we can really look at the election in the US in a really comparative perspective and see what kinds of dynamics play out in other countries and what we can learn from them in terms of what to do or what not to do. And so we have a little over 15 minutes, and in the interest of time, I will open it up to the floor for Q&A. It's also open on the Zoom, where we have quite an attendance on Zoom as well. So please feel free to ask your questions. Maybe we select about 2 or 3 altogether. Yeah, John.
Oh, should I say it and then we'll do a couple?
Yeah, we'll select.
Okay. So thank you so much to everybody. We're in the whole lot, really good thing. My question is for Professor Bilindra. I really appreciate all the statistical support for the things, but just how I understood it, the main claim you made was that xenophobia and sexism were like 2 really strong drivers for Trump's win, and then class was not as salient, or perhaps has been overemphasized. And my question is about that's certainly true for Blacks, Hispanics, and other. The whites was the one where the class was the most important. But then also the independents were also like class mattered a little bit more. So my question is, among the people that matter politically the most, isn't class what's driving things or not?
You want to?
I'll just take it from Maria. Would anyone else have to go with the question? Yeah, go ahead.
It's kind of related to immigration.
Sorry, I just have to tell you to speak a little louder for the people on.
Oh, yeah, I can do that.
Thank you.
It's kind of related to immigration, but I'm also stand up, so guys, it's easier. That's better. But kind of related to how in the United Kingdom, when they had a party switch a few years ago, they developed immigration plans like the Rwanda plan, which was obviously very far right and not very taken well by the community in the United Kingdom. How do you guys think, given the recent election in the United States, policy regarding extreme immigration bans is going to shift? And what do you guys foresee coming about that? And do you think the public is going to be so openly against it as it was in the United Kingdom? Or do you think that that type of policy is just going to swiftly go through?
Let's start with those two.
So let me address for the United States case, both of them. First, there's a difference between class, which I tried to measure in terms of college degree, and economic anxiety, which is, it can be across classes, right? People who are rich or poor can also be anxious. So what we see is that economic anxiety among people with college degrees, so the higher class people, is more likely to drive them towards Trump than people, and less so among those who are without a college degree. So in that sense, there is an effect of economic anxiety, but among the wrong people, based on, in the sense of the existing hypothesis, which is that the lower socioeconomic class has shifted to Trump because of economics. So that's one thing. In terms of independence, there's no effect of that among independents. And actually, independents are all over the place because these are pure independents. They're all over the place because typically independents are the low information voters, hence the very long confidence in because they're literally all over the place. In terms of what we expect to see in resistance to the migration policies. So migration is going to be day one, a big emphasis of the Trump administration, and we should expect a major performance, which is likely to focus on groups that are easy to get to. So people for which they have information on and are easy to round up. At the same time, there is definitely going to be a lot of resistance by organizations like the ACLU and immigrant rights groups, the way that there was with the Muslim ban at the beginning of the previous Trump administration. The difference that we don't know how it's going to play out today is learning, is the effect of how much the Trump loyalists have learned from the previous administration, and therefore how ready they are to address these issues. The second issue is the summer's decision by the Supreme Court on the immunity, which basically has given broad immunity to the president on issues under his purview. So there could be legal justifications, and I am not a lawyer, so I'm sort of speaking as a non-expert on this, but I can see legal justifications based on that decision that would seek to put in place quickly, outside of congressional support, through executive orders, policies that are incredibly cruel and would target people in immigrant communities, and probably people who have some status first, because they're easy to get, like DACA people, TPS people, asylum seekers, those groups that, you know, the government knows where they are.
And I have a question that sort of gets to some of the comments that all of you talked about. So one of the things with like talking about immigration in the US is also that it feels like a very near problem, like it's right at our border, like a fight. But I'm also thinking in terms of, you know, Rebecca, what you said about Uganda and the way that we take them to the refugee policies that, you know, Britain and the EU are now are trying to do, which is to outsource the refugee problem to an African country, to Rwanda, and to have that process at the distance. The US has done that, where it's moved its border sort of further away. The Muslim ban is one sort of manifestation of something like that. And then, you know, trying to sort of define either the political core or the demographic core of the country by sort of creating this distance in the policy before migrants are actually arriving at the borders or are being, or, people, residents who are already in the country are being expelled. So I guess I'm trying to think of like, what are the connections between specific border policies that you see in your regions, and how do those always map on to, the state's relationship with migrants? Anyone of you on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that because, I couldn't get to it before. I think that, for example, in the early years of the Cuban Revolution, when people, both in Cuba and in the United States to some extent, thought that that you couldn't have a communist country 90 miles from the United States. And for example, Lyndon B. Johnson established the Cuban Adjustment Act, which was specific to Cubans, is still in place, although I don't know for how much longer, because my country has been against it for years, and he seems to be moving up just as we speak. But basically what it said was that if somebody from Cuba entered the United States legally, after a year, one day, they could apply to be a green card holder, they could apply for residency. And that was an enormous benefit for Cubans, which kept the number of undocumented people in the group very, very low. As I said, I don't know how much longer that can actually last. But then, for example, another policy that arose out of the Cuban exodus was when Clinton was in power, and that was the summer of the Raptors crisis, where people were throwing themselves on anything that floated, on the truck tire, on the styrofoam, little boats, anything at all. And if they were found at sea, the way to deal with it, Clinton's way of dealing with that was to establish a very arbitrary policy of wet foot, dry foot policy. And wet feet meant that if you were coming on little boats from Cuba, eventually it was extended to other countries. So it was extended to people from Haiti, people from Jamaica, people from anywhere where they would get on a little boat and try to come to the United States. And basically, if the Coast Guard found you at sea and therefore your feet were wet, they would interdict you and return you back to your country, back to Cuba, to Haiti, back to wherever. If, on the other hand, the migrants happened to come through at 3 o'clock in the morning and the Coast Guard was asleep and they entered into a beach, or sometimes they held on to a bridge on the Florida Keys, then they had dry feet, and then they again would enter the country legally, and a year and 1 day after, the Cuban Adjustment Act would kick in. Obama did away with wet foot, dry foot policy. Let me say that I never liked wet foot, dry foot policy. In the first place, it was highly arbitrary, had nothing to do with people's motivations, why they were leaving. It was whether your feet were wet or dry. And a lot of people got deported back to Cuba and other countries as a result. But at least it was a way for people to be able to leave Cuba, and it gave people some hope. And I think when Obama reestablished relations with Cuba, which was a wonderful, wonderful moment in Cuban history, and people in the island felt that way about it. They even put Obama in a regular sitcom that people watch in Cuba that they love, with the figure of Panfilo. Panfilo comes across on the sitcom as an older man, sort of bent over, hardly walking, and therefore he says things, that other people in Cuba don't manage to say. And it's incredibly popular. I mean, Monday night, Cuba, you can't call, nobody will pick up the phone. They're all watching Panfilo. And Obama became a part of Panfilo's program on TV. So, the restoration of relations after 54 years of it being broken was incredibly moving. It meant a great deal to people, and it gave Cubans hope at that moment in time. But in the first few days in January, that before an old president ceases to be president, Obama did away with wet foot, dry foot policy. And after that, and I think he did it. I mean, it's actually, I haven't found any archival records that give me any more insight into it. I think he did it because he wanted Cuba so much to be a normal country, which is exactly what it is not. And it's never been. But he had this hope that that it would be one more Latin American country, facing the United States in a regular sort of way. And so he did away with it. And the result of that has been that now the only way that people can come through most of the time is to actually come through the southern border, just like Mexicans and Central Americans coming. And the number of undocumented people has risen remarkably.
Yeah, I just want to give the other panelists also a chance to session. So as Nandini was saying, one of the perhaps the unfortunate consequences of thinking about immigration as something that's extreme and migration policy it's extreme is that we lose sight of the fact that migration policymaking is actually usually quite haphazard, right? And contradictory and inconsistent. It's not just this grand, balancing act where policymakers are making these crucial decisions at one moment, right? There are a lot of unintended consequences. And so it's actually really hard to create policy that unilaterally shut borders or open borders, because migration policymaking it consists of not just the country of destination to the host country, but also the countries of origin, as well as the transit country, right? And so if you look at, the East Asian cases, most of the kind of migrant worker programs are built on bilateral arrangements between the host country and one country, usually in Southeast Asia. So they're usually based on MOUs or memorandum of understanding. And so you're not going to see the same policy applied unilaterally to all so-called migrant groups, not even all of Southeast Asian migrant groups, because you have different kind of pressures coming from these, sending countries, also different levels of power, right? That relative power that they might have, whether, threats to not send high-skilled migrants, right, to these particular countries. Threats to take away particular nurses, for example, so there are these competing pressures. So, even though it might be hard to see them, now, but, migration policy making is much more intricate and complex than what than one person's win, right? And so in this respect, we might definitely see this performative aspect, this kind of sweeping set of restrictions that are targeting low-hanging fruit, right? But it doesn't mean that it's going to basically result in sweeping, restrictions across categories. It's going to be a lot more contradictory
Or immediate.
Yes, exactly. Rebecca, do you want the last word? We have
Oh gosh. Just to add to that, so in my own personal capacity, I worked with a refugee resettlement agency, and through that, I really, since 2016, so I really saw, this in action. The joke about how people ask, is DC like House of Cards or West Wing? It's really more like Veep, where it's like people are kind of not super competent. But what I saw was that, okay, Trump, he was like, refugee numbers are going to go down, and Biden came in and was like, nope, they're going to go up. We're going to have a more empathetic policy. The thing is that they can't meet those numbers, even if they went from 50,000 to 100,000, 100,000. Like this year, it is November 13th, and they haven't been able to. I think the cap is 150 or 120, and they're I think at 90,000. Yeah, 120. Yeah, and I think they're 90,000, and we have less than 2 months to go. So I do agree, things are going to get policy making, especially policy implementation, is very haphazard. And I think we need to really watch for what is window dressing and what is not. I think as just voters or lay people, that's kind of what we need to think about.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good sort of note to end on. We are at exactly 5:30. So please join me in thanking all of our. This is our last big event of the fall semester, so there is a reception. Please stick around and talk to us a little bit more, and we'll see you in the winter.